Live from the palatial studios at Emerson College in beautiful downtown Boston, this is the Jeff Santos Show on the Revolution Radio Network. Rebuilding America, together, investing, activism, and supporting the middle class. Now, here's Jeff.
Thank you, Shane, and good afternoon, Americans, and welcome to the Jeff Santos Show. We are live in Studio A on the campus of Emerson College. It is great to be with you today on this beautiful 50-degree day here in Boston, the 8th of March, 2016. Getting closer to a decision on who is going to be the Democratic nominee and Republican nominees. Big night tonight. Primarily in Michigan, although for the Republicans, they have other states, Idaho and Mississippi. There's also a caucus in Hawaii for the Republicans. So we'll see what happens with Mr. Trump and company. On the Democratic side, of course, big night for Bernie Sanders and a big night for Hillary Clinton in the state of Michigan. They also play in Mississippi, but that should be a foregone conclusion that Miss Clinton should win down there. But we have lots to talk about with you, and of course, we love your emails, Jeff at revolutionboston.com. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter at Jeff Santos Show as well. You can you can tell that I've been doing a lot of shouting lately because my voice isn't as good as it used to be, but we're getting back to normal. But here are a couple of thoughts. And first of all, a couple of guests today. Mark Taylor-Canfield will join us at 3:34. A little bit on the Washington state primary and Washington caucus. The caucus is coming up in late March on the 26th. The primary coming up in May, and I don't know why they're going to have both, but they're kind of weird in that regard. As we say here in Boston, wicked weird. We'll find out what Mark has to say. Gus Morales of Badass Teachers of Massachusetts will join us at 4:06. We'll talk to, more than likely, Neil Soroka, Democracy for America, at 5 o'clock, and Robert Craig will wrap it up with us at 5:30. But here is, my take on what we are dealing with here with the Democratic Party. A lot of people were interested in hearing about a Joe Biden running. They were interested in Elizabeth Warren, and it ended up being that the alternative to Hillary Clinton was Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie Sanders, in my opinion, has run an amazing race considering all the disadvantages that he has had. He didn't depend upon Wall Street for donations. He went at it the old-fashioned way, meaning people in their communities and the bigger community online of Bernie Sanders, and that is how he's been able to sort of move the agenda. And I think that a lot of people who are looking for change want to see him succeed. But let me throw something at you that I think Democrats and progressives should be aware of. If Bernie Sanders is not the nominee, there will be a number of Democrats, particularly working class Democrats, white, and some minorities, but mainly white, working class males, that will end up going to Donald Trump. Now, I know that for a lot of you say, well, they're just people who are angry at the world. Well, that may be so, but there are a lot of people who want massive change in our government. I mean, a lot of people over the years, and I'm talking about over the last 50 years since the 1960s, have been dissatisfied with their government. There was a brief, and I mean brief, hope that in 2008, with the first African-American president, with a major change, not from the usual politicians that have been around for 20 years or 30 years, but somebody who was relatively new to Washington, had been a state senator just 5 years earlier, in his hometown or his home state of Illinois, and really was not necessarily the insider. Well, we gave him a chance. A lot of progressives were extremely excited. I was one of them. Went down to Washington, D.C. in 2008, and with thousands and thousands of people celebrated his inaugural. And then within a matter of months, we had the appointment of Rahm Emanuel as chief of staff. There goes single payer. Max Baucus made sure of that as the healthcare leader in the Senate. And then we went back in the summertime, and we had protest after protest in the summer of 2009 and later in 2010 on the healthcare issue. We never get out of first base. The $1 billion infrastructure package, stimulus package was not big enough. The civil engineers still wanting trillions and trillions, got less than $1 trillion. So we are at a point where a lot of people were disappointed. And in 2010, not many people showed up for Barack Obama or for the Democrats. The Jeff Santos Show at 3:30 Eastern Time, 12:30 Pacific. We go west, and we go west to see our good friend, the great independent journalist out of Puget Sound, Seattle, Washington State. And we're talking, of course, about our good friend, Mark Taylor-Canfield. Mark, how are you, my friend?
Good, Jeff. Talking to you from sunny Seattle, although, I'm not supposed to tell people that it's sunny in Seattle. We're supposed to let everybody know that it rains all the time. But I believe
always trying to keep that population down, aren't you?
Well, yeah, good luck with that right now. But International Women's Day, right? I think today is actually International Women's Day, so congratulations to all the women out there for having international recognition.
There you go. I'm all for that. Well, I'm interested in talking to you about what is the status of the Washington primary and the Washington caucus. We have had a lot of discussions on this show about, I think, getting rid of caucuses. I think they're ridiculous. A lot of problems. We've had one in Iowa in which we threw things up in the air, and when there were a tie vote, we decided by a flip of a coin. In Nevada, of course, they do things a little weird. In Nevada, they don't flip a coin, they flip a card. Plus the Harry Reid last-second phone call to get all the workers to vote for Hillary Clinton. So I'm not a big fan of caucuses, even though Bernie Sanders has done well in some of them, including this weekend. But I'm interested in the fact that this caucus primary system, you have both, that whoever wins the caucus the numbers will connect to the primary. Is that right? It's also kind of weird, but again, the caucus system.
Yeah, it is a confusing process in Washington State, and there have been many moves to do away with the caucus system because of this impression that it can be manipulated by the party insiders. So Washington has both caucuses and primaries. There was actually a Republican Party caucus took place on February 20th. However, good luck trying to get any information on how that came out, because the Washington State Republican Party has decided to allocate delegates only according to the results of our primary, which actually happens on May 24th. But we are a mail-in voting state, so there will be an 18-day voting period before the presidential primary in May. So officially, the results will come in on May 24th, but it starts on May 6th. And then the Democrats have a different schedule. So the Democratic State Party caucuses are actually on March 26th. Now, according to the Secretary of State's website and the Washington State Democratic Party officials that I've spoken to, the Democrats have decided to use only the caucus results to allocate delegates. So they are not even really paying much attention to this statewide primary on May 24th. However, the Republicans have done the exact opposite. And under this state law, it's left up to the parties to decide how they want to allocate these delegates, whether they want to use the caucus or the primary results. Well, the Republicans say that they are only going to use the primary results. So the caucuses that took place on February 21st were, I guess, more of a social gathering for people to get together and kind of unify on the presidential campaigns. But yes, the Democrats have said that they are only going to use the caucus results. So, yeah, I know it's very confusing to people. And actually, what's funny, Jeff, is if you go to the Secretary of State's website in Washington, what you'll see is a man kind of rolling his eyes at the top of the website with a bunch of question marks around his head, because that actually does reflect how a lot of people feel about the system here. Even the Secretary of State.
Well done, web developer.
Yeah, but, it's really a confusing system, and it's the result of many years of court challenges to Washington's blanket primary system. And so then there was some legislation that was passed that created this dual system. So it's really confusing. I'm sure it's confusing for the national parties as well, because, they have two different dates to worry about, and yet, as far as the Democrats are concerned in Washington State, the primary is sort of a useless exercise, because they are going to allocate the delegates according to the caucuses. And so the Washington State Bernie Sanders campaign is full on right now, trying to register people to vote and also to register people for the caucuses. And for the Democratic Party caucuses, you do not have to be 18 years old on March 26th. You just have to prove that you will be 18 before the general election in November. So there will be probably a lot of young folks who will be showing up who actually aren't even eligible to vote yet. But according to the way the rules have been set up, they can attend the caucuses. So that's the situation in Washington State. Like I said, it's confusing. I couldn't find any information from the Republicans on how their caucus actually turned out and who got the most votes. They just say on their website, it was a great time, and, a lot of people gathered, So it's really confusing.
Talking to Mark Taylor-Canfield here on the Jeff Santos Show, and I guess so, to say the least, confusing. But, Bernie Sanders should do well. I mean, after all, we started off several months ago when Sanders had these big crowds, or as he likes to say, huge crowds. And, it was, I think the biggest one was in Seattle, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, it was L.A. had a big one too, I believe, and Boston had one. But there was 20,000 people in Seattle, right? Portland as well, yes, exactly.
Yeah, Portland had a lot of people as well. And actually, just recently, I think we've talked about this before, there's been a series of music industry fundraisers in Seattle where DJs, bands, music promoters, club owners have got together and organized some fundraisers. So there's been a series of fundraisers. The last one took place on Saturday. It was called Bernie Down the House. And I'm sure, David Byrne and the Talking Heads would be happy with that.
Right. Right.
And according to one of the organizers I spoke to, they were able to raise $10,000 just at this one night event, and it's been a series of events that have been happening since November of last year, actually. So, a lot of strong support, but most of the people that were there, and by the way, most of the volunteers at that event were actually female. So there's sort of a Women for Bernie thing going on in Seattle too. But, they were able to raise quite a bit of money in a very short period of time. So it's very, consistent with the national campaign in terms of individual contributions really adding up. And yes, I believe, and talking to other Democratic Party activists and Bernie Sanders campaign reps, I really think that Bernie has a great chance of winning the Washington State primary. He just is so incredibly popular here. And I think a lot of folks in Washington State also realize that, there are a lot of negatives associated with the candidacy of Hillary Clinton, including some polls showing, a sort of a lack of trust amongst the voters for her, whereas Bernie tends to, even Fox News reported that Bernie Sanders rates really high in the polls in terms of his trustworthiness. So, and an example of that may have been, during this recent Democratic Party town hall, where Bernie Sanders is tweeting today that Mrs. Clinton misrepresented his vote on bailing out the auto industry. So there's a YouTube video out right now that, shows Bernie talking. His comment was, when you supported so many disastrous international trade agreements, you tend to get very defensive, and occasionally you say things that are inaccurate. So in a very polite way, he was saying that she lied, basically. So there you go.
I think no doubt about that.
He's going to do great in Washington State. People love him here, and people in Washington State are used to independent, progressive politicians like Jim McDermott and folks who really push the progressive agenda here. So Bernie fits into that mold. He's a perfect candidate for the Pacific Northwest, for Washington and Oregon.
Well, we're gonna find out soon enough. Just a few weeks away. We're talking with Mark Taylor-Canfield here on the Jeff Santos Show. We're right back after this timeout. You're tuned in to the Revolution Radio Network. 49 minutes past the hour. It is the Jeff Santos Show. Coming to you live from Studio A, the campus of Emerson College. Talking with my good friend Mark Taylor-Canfield here on the program. Mark, the issue of trade is something that we talk a lot about. And, of course, today is the Michigan primary, and next week you get places like Ohio and Illinois, which are obviously right in the heart of the manufacturing base of this country. But the issue of TPP has obviously created a lot of angst for a lot of political people and a lot of labor unions in Washington State. Obviously, a lot of protests in the streets as well. What is the latest on this issue that, again, gets more place in the Midwest? But I know there are a lot of people who are very passionate about how bad this is for the state of Washington and the people of Seattle.
Well, today in Michigan, I think, that will be a major factor, because a lot of the reason that Michigan has just been destroyed economically is because of these kinds of trade agreements with, the middle class basically being sold out, and all of these good, middle class union jobs being shipped overseas. So, even though Washington State maybe hasn't suffered as much, and even though we have billions of dollars of trade with the Pacific Rim especially, it's not a very popular idea. It's not part of it's certainly not something that the Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party in Washington State supports. We had David Spring, who's a longtime Democratic Party activist and has run for office several times in Washington State. And he was on with our Democracy Watch News crew for our national press briefing that we have every week on Thursdays. By the way, it's produces a podcast called Democracy Cast, so you can check it out at Libsyn or iTunes. But he was talking about this issue, and we have to remember that Seattle, especially, is the home of the world famous protests against the World Trade Organization. So trade,
sure,
in the Seattle area is a big issue, but most of the progressives here are against the TPP and against a lot of these past trade agreements like GATT and NAFTA. The thing is that our congressional representatives, like Jim McDermott, he got a lot of heat from progressives, and sometimes people would run against him on this issue. But our local city officials, almost all of them in Seattle, are against these trade agreements, and a lot of our county officials as well. So on a local level, there's no support for these trade agreements. Of course, the labor unions were a major part of the demonstrations against the World Trade Organization in 1999. So there's a lot of labor opposition to these trade agreements as well, of course. And I think that's really going to play into Bernie Sanders' hand in the Seattle area especially. Now, we've talked before about how the eastern side of the state tends to be more conservative and more Republican. So I don't know if he's going to get that many votes from the folks in Yakima or Spokane. But on the west side of the state, it is definitely a major issue. And Hillary Clinton just does not look good in terms of her past support of these trade agreements. And so I think there's going to be a backlash against her in Washington state. It's just something that the progressive agenda in the Northwest and in Seattle especially has been against these trade agreements for a long time, so it's nothing new. And, you know, this time Bernie is on the right side of the issue, and since there are so few candidates on the national level that have taken that position, it's another reason why so many people are flocking to his campaign in this part of the country. It's a very, very important issue to people here, and it really, like I said, even though Seattle especially is doing quite well in terms of employment and a lot of corporate and high-tech investment here, we see what's happened to the rest of the country. We know what it's like in Detroit right now. Anybody who can a trip across the country and visited the Rust Belt knows exactly what I'm talking about. Just incredible amount of economic displacement due to these trade agreements. So in Washington, Bernie is the guy. He is strong on that issue. He doesn't back down on it. It's very clear that there's a huge split amongst some of the top party officials and leadership and the grassroots in Washington state, and that's represented just perfectly by the difference between the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Bernie Sanders campaign on issues of international trade. Like I said, you know, there are billions of dollars that go through the Port of Seattle every year due to international trade, but there's a general sense amongst the grassroots here, especially in the Democratic Party, that it's just not a good idea to sign these trade agreements. They're considered undemocratic and economically and environmentally damaging to the country. And also, you know, this issue of labor rights is something that is very strong in Washington. And so the trade agreements are not popular amongst the people that are going to support Bernie Sanders, that's for sure.
How many teachers and labor union leaders who have not been endorsed, I should say, have been endorsed, the leadership, that is, has endorsed Secretary Clinton. But as we yesterday talked with Larry Cohen of the Sanders campaign, former CWA president, communication workers, and there are a lot of people who are in the membership of these unions who are actually backing Bernie. Do you see that on the ground in Seattle? Whether it's trying to rally students, or you're seeing it in terms of the protest against TPP?
Well, there is a split amongst some of the labor unions here, just as there is in the rest of the country, and as was represented in Nevada, where most of the grassroots rank and file are very much against, let's say they're not against Hillary Clinton so much as they're for Bernie Sanders. And so you have this disconnect going on where a lot of the labor union leadership and some of the Democratic Party officials are supporting Hillary Clinton. Meanwhile, the people that are actually going to get out and vote and show up at these caucuses and put their, money on the line and support the Bernie Sanders campaign, they do not agree. There was a discussion I had with a member of the stagehand workers union who said that, she was very disappointed that the leadership there had chosen to endorse Hillary Clinton, even though she felt that most of the rank and file supported Bernie Sanders. So you're looking at a little bit of a revolution, within the Democratic Party here, and in some of the labor unions where the leadership is being challenged by the rank and file and by the grassroots to do what they think is the right thing. But unfortunately, just like in the rest of the country, in terms of our congressional delegation and the governor's office, there is a premature endorsement for Clinton's candidacy, and that is a sore spot for a lot of voters in Washington state. So the primaries the caucuses actually might be an opportunity for people to sort of make that plain. And so I'm hoping, and the Bernie Sanders campaign, I'm sure, is hoping that a lot of people are going to show up at these caucuses and stand really firm on their support for Bernie Sanders, regardless of whatever machinations are going on within the Democratic Party and whatever pressure, is coming from the top.
It'll be interesting for sure, and we'll see if, before you get to the 26th, what is the status of the race before we get to Seattle. Mark Taylor-Canfield, talk to you next Tuesday. Great report as usual, my friend. All the best.
Thanks, Jeff. Take care. Talk to you next week.
Talk to you next week. We're right back after this. Time out. And off we went into 2012. And the fact is that at that point, even though Obama won, it would be considered an electoral landslide. It could have been much closer. And 2014 came along, and Democrats ran away from Obama, and then they ran away from the leadership in the Senate, and now we are faced with a House and Senate, which, of course, does nothing but complain about the first African-American president, which they hated from day one. And nothing really gets done from Obama's perspective because he can't get anything through the Senate. So we have paralysis. And that is why I think that a lot of people are going to look to Donald Trump, as screwed up as he is, as xenophobic as he is, as racist as he is. I'm not saying the guy hates people of color, but he certainly doesn't show a lot of love toward them. I'll leave it at that. So, with that being said, he is the only other guy besides Bernie Sanders that is not relying on Wall Street to basically fund his campaign. He's self-funding. So that gives him a certain amount of independence. Now, he's still a guy who's a billionaire. He's not all of a sudden going to change those stripes. But I think a lot of people, and again, I say to the progressive community here, particularly to those who are sort of wishy-washy about whether their support for Bernie Sanders or whether they should support Hillary Clinton. Don't be surprised that a lot of people may not necessarily support Hillary Clinton. And that particularly a lot of white men, say 35 or 40 and over, are going to look at this and say, I can't do this. And I've been hearing a lot of people that I talk with all around the country. And a lot of them will say, well, she is just a part of her husband's legacy. She's not much different than Obama, who has disappointed a lot of us when we thought he was the change that he talked about. And what ended up happening is that a lot of people, once again, have been excited by Bernie Sanders, and maybe Bernie Sanders will win the presidency or win the nomination. But it could very well be that he doesn't. And where will his voters go? No, a lot of them will go to Hillary Clinton because they are left of center. But will they go there with passion? And will they go there with the idea that Hillary Clinton is the change that we gave our dollars to? And I say we because I have given a few bucks along the way, not a lot, to Bernie Sanders. And I think that a lot of people are frustrated that the mainstream media doesn't really recognize what Bernie Sanders has done, the 8 states that he has won. And I think that they are wondering, well, if they're not recognizing us now, and what is it going to be like if we're not on the ticket? Why all of a sudden are people who voted for Bernie Sanders going to be recognized? So that's why I think that there are a lot of folks that potentially, if you're looking for the outsider and you're looking for somebody who is going to not be tied to Wall Street, and if you can overlook the racist, xenophobic part of this, then maybe Trump's your guy. He's not mine. But people need to be aware that if you place as your nominee somebody who has a tremendous amount of baggage as the nominee of the party, emails, the husband's extramarital affairs, all of these issues, it is not going to be easy to win an election. And I want people to know that. And as we enter Michigan and next week Illinois and Florida and Missouri and Ohio, people need to realize what is best for the party and what is best for the country. They actually, in this case, make the best sense. We're right back after this timeout. You're tuned in to the Jeff Santos Show. Because we've had, two Democratic presidents that either by choice or by force have gone to the center right, and we've had that kind of government or lack thereof over the last 40, 50 years. Going back to the days of the Kennedy and Johnson administration, which was the last time we were really left. And, really the point is that since then we've moved, slowly to the right under Nixon, and then under Carter was somewhere in the middle. And then by the time we get to the 80s, we moved far to the right with Ronald Reagan, and it's just been going that way since. Even though Bill Clinton and Obama were president for 16 years, they had Republican Congresses, blocking their views, but not sure if Bill Clinton would have changed, even if he had a Democratic Congress, because he doesn't really believe in that kind of progressive politics. He at one point said he favors more of the Republican Tom Keane than he does of the Democrats. Well, you might as well be a Republican.
Our progressive radio here seems to be disappointing many progressives because of what they perceive as a slant toward Hillary Clinton, favoring her more than talking, as neutral situation between the two candidates. And the listenership, I think, is dropping off because of that.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens, in this next few weeks, Rudy, and we will obviously be on top of it right here on the Jeff Santos Show. Rudy, thank you, my friend. We're right back with your calls and our good friend Mark Taylor-Canfield after this timeout.